Welcome to the Chatham United Methodist Church. It is so good to have you here. We have been looking forward to this evening, and we trust that God has something good for us all tonight from whatever traditions are our faith traditions or lack of faith traditions. The Spirit transcends all of that, and we are so grateful to have Pádraig Ó Tuama here this evening. You'll see some rough outline of the program tonight. After the introductions, Pádraig is going to be speaking about poetry and prayer and anything else he wants to speak about. And then at 8 o'clock-ish, you let the Spirit lead you, Pádraig. We'll have some time of Q&A, and I will bring a microphone to those of you who would like to ask Pádraig a question. And then we'll try and wrap this up at about 8:30-ish. You'll see that this event is subsidized by the Fran Boyer Fund. Some of you knew Fran Boyer. She was a faithful member of the Chatham United Methodist Church, and her husband, George, gave us a gift, and the church council decided to set aside a small fund in honor and memory of Fran. And we asked George, what are some words that encapsulate Fran's hopes for the world? What were her values? And without hesitation, he said civility, community, and compassion. And so those are our guiding principles on when we use the Fran Boyer Fund. If it promotes those three values, civility, community, and compassion, that's God's way of saying yes, move forward. And tonight, all three of those words have an opportunity to grow in our lives, in this community, through Pádraig's poetry and wisdom and presence. Pádraig is a force that God uses in the world to bring goodness, to bring some healing, to bring some beauty through words and presence and art. He makes a difference, and we are so honored and blessed to have him here in Chatham. I asked Pádraig just before coming in, I said, you've probably sat through all sorts of introductions, and what would you like? And he said, just say this: poet, theologian, presents Poetry Unbound. If you would like to contribute to offset some of the costs of this evening, you can click on this QR code, or you can put an offering in the plates in the front and the back. You can breathe easier. We have installed an air purification system in the sanctuary and in the church. You can read about that by hitting that QR code. And on the back, you can see a short bio about Pádraig Ó Tuama and some of the books that he has published, and he may tell you about some of the books that are about to be published. So with that, can we welcome Pádraig Ó Tuama?
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you to everybody for being here. It's such a lovely thing to be with you. I've just come from a very nice barbecue, and I'm feeling filled with good food and hospitality and conversation. And we're going to talk tonight about poetry and prayer. Years ago, I was in a coffee shop in Cork. It's gone now, unfortunately. It was a coffee shop I loved, and I was reading a book of short lectures that were written by Anthony de Mello, that Jesuit. Some of you might know Anthony de Mello. And the book was collected into this category called Contact with God. That was the title of the book. It was a very old book, and so the title was just in bold letters on the front. And when I finished the book, because I was on the last couple of chapters, I closed it and put it down, and the man sitting opposite me, because this coffee shop had long Dutch-style tables, as we'd call them, so the fellow sitting opposite me said, well, are you in contact with God now? And I said, I'm not sure. And he said, well, why are you reading the book? And I was like, well, I like how Anthony de Mello talks. And when it comes to the question about prayer, we're in the presence of a mystery. Why do we pray? For all kinds of reasons, I suppose, is the answer. Do we know what those reasons are? Well, maybe some. Do we fully know what even some of those reasons are? I don't think we do. We pray, first of all, because it's an eruption of desire. The word in English, prayer, comes from French prier, which means to request, to ask. Prithee, you might hear in some old English texts. Help me, prithee, I pray thee. We used to say that before. And so to pray is to be in contact, is to be in a house of desire. And will your desires be met and fulfilled? I don't know. Some of them will, some of them won't. Some of them might be, some of them half will be, some of them will change. Sometimes it's a crisis when your request is met because you were more in contact with your desire than you were with the fulfillment of that desire. And prayer gathers all of those experiences together. I think prayer is the most secular thing we can talk about because prayer is rarely only related to the question of doctrine. Prayer is related to the human experience. What do you want? And what do you do with your desire? And where do you place your desire? And how do you find a home for it? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, finding a home for desire. I'm going to do all of this through poems and prayers that I've written because I think poetry allows a certain kind of emptiness to be present with us. And what we need, certainly, in places where there's lots of language about religion, places where there's lots of architecture around the idea of God, what we certainly need is blank space and silence, what Meister Eckhart would call unknowing. We need all of these experiences to remind us of a mystery that we're in front of, that we behold and also don't behold. We hope we're beheld by. And somehow that this experience of an intimate nothing can become something that can hold us. I'm a formalist often when it comes, or certainly a structuralist when it comes to poetry. I do like form, I like sonnets, I like villanelles. And so years ago when I read a book about prayer by Walter Wangerin Jr., that magnificent Lutheran writer who just died very recently, a great, great writer. He has a small book called Whole Prayer, and he has a paragraph in it on the form of collect. You find collects in lots of the Christianities around the world. Collect is just a posh Anglican way of saying collect. It just means to gather in. And a collect is at least 1,000 years old in terms of its strict form. And a collect has 5 folds, I suppose. The first fold is to address who you're praying to. And then the next fold is to say something about the one you're speaking to. And then the next fold is to name one desire. And then the fourth fold is to say something about the desire you've named. And then to finish with a bird of praise. And so the collect for purity that you find in at least the Anglican Church, maybe plenty of other ones too. Almighty God, to whom all hearts are open and all desires known, cleanse the thoughts of my hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. Through Christ our Lord, amen. That's a classic collect. So the first fold, you name God, Almighty God, nice and easy. The second one is you say something more about the one you've named, to whom all hearts are open and all desires known, and from whom no secrets can be hid. I bet you some of you picked up that I forgot that the first time. And judged me. And then the third part is to name a single desire. Cleanse the thoughts of my heart by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit. And then the fourth part is to say, why? Why are you asking that? That we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. And then the fifth part, a little bird of praise, through Christ our Lord, amen. And when you look at formal collects in the Book of Common Prayer, in any of these books throughout the last millennium really, you'll find that most of the collects follow that very simple 5-fold form. So Walter Wangerin Jr. has a paragraph in Whole Prayer about that, and it changed my life. I read it when I was 18, I think, 19. And it really made me realize that there can be a structure, poetic structure to the question of the language we use in the face of the Almighty, in the face of the great intimate everything and nothing all at once. So here's a few collects that I've written for the Church of the Heavenly Rest in New York City, where I've been doing a residency. Usually I like to write a collect in response to a text, and so the text for this is one of my favorites. I love and I'm fascinated by the incidents that are narrated in 3 of the 4 Gospels where Jesus of Nazareth is tempted in the wilderness. I think they're extraordinary narratives. Mark's is the shortest and would be ignorable except for one little detail. And here's the text from Mark 1:13. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts. So here's the collect. Jesus of the animals, when you'd been led to the end, even at the start, you found friends in unexpected places. Animals with warm hearts and fur, strange tastes and needs and habits. When we are at the end, meet us in the touch of beasts uninterested in grand designs, because in your own emptiness you knew what you needed, and you found it in claw and fur and teeth and pointed ears. Amen. I always finish with an amen because I just find it easier. I am far from anything dogmatic. I'm much more at home really in being in the room next door to belief. I wouldn't say anymore that I'm in the room of belief. I'm just next door, influenced by the murmurs that come through the wall, and probably too hurt by the claims of doctrine and by the demands of doctrine too. But nonetheless, my life would be lived in an echo to the murmurs I hear from the room next door. Here's another text from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, "Blessed is the person who has struggled. They have found life." So here's a collect. Jesus of the struggle, you never promised ease. Yours the pained heart. Ours the pained heart too. You promised life in the hustle and bustle of the everyday. Meet us in this tussle so that we may find energy to keep going. Meet us with rest too. You needed it. We do too. Amen. And then probably my favorite quote from any of the non-canonical Gospels is this one. A person said to him meaning Jesus, this is from the Gospel of Thomas, verse 72. A person said to him, "Tell my brothers to divide my father's possessions with me." Jesus said to him, "O man, who has made me a divider?" What a question. Who has made me a divider? So here's the collect. Distant Jesus, you are often hard to grasp. Help us see where we break the things we say we wish to save, so that we might imagine a different kind of being in this world together. Amen. Tell my brothers to divide my father's possessions with me. The idea of breaking something in order to be faithful to it. The pain that comes in grief, the complication, I'm sure plenty of you know that comes in the wake of grief and comes in trying to understand what do we do to be faithful to memory and sentiment and object. Why do I feel so strangely attached to a particular thing? And what is that earthquake that's erupting between me and somebody who I might share DNA with? And what are we preserving while we're breaking? And what are we breaking in the name of preserving it? These are old stories that continue. I've trained as a conflict mediator, and one of the most complicated places to be a conflict mediator is with a family in grief who are trying to figure out what to do with everything that's been left behind. And it isn't only the families who had conflict before the death that experience conflict after it. Often unexpected conflicts can erupt, and grief manifests itself in all kinds of strange ways. And we are breaking something in the name of keeping something. It's a strange mystery. It's hard to name, and it's hard to know where resolution can come in the context of that without something like what we might call conversion towards each other. Something like love, something like, maybe people would call it grace. I don't like that word very much, but I understand why people do like it. And so I think it's interesting that the Gospel of Thomas too is so attentive to the strange way that desire manifests in us. When we say that prayer is a house of desire, that therefore means that prayer is a strange beast, because our desires are strange, unknowable beasts sometimes, where you watch yourself going, why am I acting like I'm deranged? Where does this strange energy come from in me? If prayer is not a home for that, well then we're in trouble. And so therefore prayer must be a strange home for us, because we are strange people. Well, I am. Talk for myself. I'm going to read a few poems that are based on the Bible. I have always been fascinated by the Bible. At the age of 9, I begged my parents for a Bible for Christmas, and they got me it, a children's Bible with pictures, and I still have it. It was in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. There was a picture of the devil in it, which was my favourite picture. And I am here to inform you categorically and with authority that the devil is blue and has flame red eyes and does fortunately have an identifying tail. So always easy to spot in a crowd. In a strange way, my fascination with the devil as a 9-year-old was beneficial, because I was put through exorcisms for being gay about 10 years later, and I had been thinking about the devil for a long time before people told me I had one. And so that certainly laid intellectual ground for theological speculation. But we'll come to that later on. There is a devil lurking around the corner for us, in fact a few. And so I have been intrigued by the literature of the Bible for a very long time and studied it, and currently on my 3rd degree in theology, I keep on needing to do more of them, because I keep on thinking that I haven't learned enough. And there's something so interesting about being part of a literary community, which is ultimately what any religious community is. It is a literary community. People gathered around a text and practices around that text that say that this text holds some kind of shape for us and holds us in some kind of shape, and that to differing levels and differing ways of reading, that there is some kind of faithfulness in the general direction of a text. And I think that's fascinating, and it's a really interesting thing to be around people who take a literature or a library of literature so seriously enough as to use it as some kind of way to shape their actions in the world. So I too am not sure what I think about anything, but I know I love the text. And so here's a poem called Make Believe. Make believe. And on the first day, God made something up. Then everything came along. Seconds, sex, and beasts, and breaths, and rabies. Hunger, healing, lust and lust's rejections. Swarming things that swarm inside the dirt. Girth, and grind, and grit, and shit, and all shit's functions. Rings inside the tree trunk, and branches broken by the snow. Pigs' hearts, and stars. Mystery, suspense, and stingrays. Insects, blood, and interests, and death. Eventually, us. With all our viruses, laments, and curiosities, all our songs and made-up stories, and our songs about the stories we've forgotten, and all that we've forgotten. And to hold it all together, God made time, a kind of story that makes this thing stick to that. Here's another Eden poem. It's called The First Fight. Afterwards, Adam wandered round, naming things. Mountain, he said, covered in sweat from a day's hike, and breeze cooling down. Then earthquake, watching forests fall beneath the earth's shifting plates. God arrived, unnoticed. Avoidance, God said. Adam turned around. Who invited you? Eve sent me, God replied. She is naming all the things that are underneath the earth, things that will cause the rise and the fall of many other things. Adam sat down and began to cry. Tears, he said, and rage and frustration at all I feel and cannot say, and shut up, God interrupted. Adam turned around. God had gone away. I'm interested in the strange places in between texts because that's where I've lived. And I think it's where we've all lived. It is to say that to read a text about a particular lineage of matriarchs and patriarchs, you can often feel like, well, I'm just getting the bus to work, or I'm just waiting for the kettle to boil, or I'm just waiting for the results of the test from the hospital, or I'm just this and I'm just that. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about the text is that the Bible is filled with complicated families. I've got a sequence of poems called Screwed Up Families of the Bible, except I don't say the word screwed, I say words that rhyme with truck, but I will spare your American ears from Irish strong language. Here's a poem called Family Tree, and partly my exploration of this is because I don't know any family in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian text that I'd want to belong to. And when people say things like, well, we just need to get back to biblical family values, I think, well, only if you want a criminal record. I have been utterly influenced and changed by having studied with Jews who said to me originally, some friends over meals, you ask stupid questions about the Bible. And I said, what do you mean? And they were like, you seem to be frightened of the idea of asking a question. And I was like, yeah, they were correct. So they were like, ask better questions. That led me on to the study of Midrash and to the writing and work of Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. If any of you might know some of her work, she's got a book called The Murmuring Deep, which is explorations of the biblical unconscious. Amazing writer. She's just released a new book about, it's about the book of Leviticus. Is it called Explorations on the Order of Intimacy? Something like that. I've got it, but I haven't started it yet, apart from the first page. And she explores the millennia-old practice of Midrash, which is really just asking good questions about the gaps in between the text and asking questions that mean you're taking the text seriously enough to ask serious questions about it, and knowing that you may not get answers, but knowing that you might find space in the questions. And when you look at the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, it's a complicated one for sure. Abraham takes Isaac up the mountain. Sarah dies while Abraham is up there. They never see her again. There's an old midrash that says that while he was up the mountain, while Abraham and Isaac were up the mountain, that the Satan character appeared to Sarah and said, "Where's your husband?" And she said, "I don't know." And the Satan character said, "Oh, I do. He's up the mountain about to kill your son." And then the Satan character went, "Oh, sorry, no, he's not. Actually, he is. No, he's not. Actually, he is." This terrible teasing thing, and that Sarah died out of shock in not knowing what was happening. Anyway, the interesting thing, there's another midrash that says, and this was written during the Babylonian exile, it says, what did Abraham and Isaac talk about when they went down the mountain? Because Isaac, according to the numbering of the text, was either 28 or 32. This was no little 6-year-old. And so the text names him as an adult man when this happened. Anyway, they probably talked about nothing because they didn't go down the mountain together. Abraham went down the mountain and Isaac followed Hagar into the desert. It's extraordinary. Isaac followed somebody into wilderness looking for a representation of the truth in his own geography, like so many of us do. And then years later, one of the interpretations of the text of the next person that Abraham marries is that Abraham marries Hagar, because Hagar is just a title, kind of like chief of staff. And so then you see Isaac, an older man, obsessed with his own death, unable to see anything, desperate to pass on a birthright, but he doesn't die for 20 more years after he's tricked through that soup. No wonder he was obsessed with death, having been visited by it as a younger man by his own father. Of course, how could you do anything but? It makes so much sense. And suddenly we see these sophisticated, complicated lives that would have given Freud, many years of clients, because there's a deep recognition of the human condition in the brilliance of these interrelated ways of speaking. And we see in biblical family values something that is remarkably recognizable today. They didn't have iPhones, but they had a heart and a soul and a brain, and that the people who wrote these texts had deep and complicated insights into what it's like to be a human person. And it's for this reason that I love the text. Not because it prescribes the way forward, but because it tells the messy way things are. Here's a poem called Family Tree. Hopefully that's the longest introduction to any of the poems I've written. Family Tree. They say Satan teased Sarah while her husband tied their son up on a mountain. It's an old story. A man tests the limits of religion while the devil's on a mission to a woman. The devil said, "He's dead." Oh no, he's not. Sarah heard a gunshot and did the only thing she could. She reached beyond herself and died. Meanwhile, Isaac sees a frenzy on the face of a patriarch and an angel screaming out a name, and everything's going dark. Afterwards, they never spoke again. One went his way and the other went another. Isaac's mother dead, he followed Hagar to the desert. Hagar married Abraham, but Isaac stayed away, didn't even send a text. He pulled the blinds down, tried to rest. Then his father died, so God blessed Isaac. Isaac never quite recovered from the loss. Then Rebecca came along and saw it all. She'd studied Freud, and so knew her boys would tell stories that their father couldn't bear. She tore her hair out, then devised a plan. But even she was foiled. Her boys grew up. Her boys forgot the fights of childhood, spat out bitter herbs, and limped towards each other when the angels settled down at last. There may not be a God or a Sarah. There may not be a garden or a man who ordered soup up to his room. There may not be a mountain. But there's always been a woman with the truth. And there's always been a brother full of shame. There's always been a story. And there's always been a devil in the details. I am intrigued by the character of Jesus of Nazareth, and I mentioned that I found the stories of the temptation in the wilderness intriguing, even as a child. And when I started to study theology, I was interested in trying to understand how is it that this literature makes any sense? Who told who what? And why would you be tempted by these seemingly innocuous things? What do they mean? So here's a sonnet called Wild. I suppose partly I think that there was no Satan, that Satan is just a name for a function of coming to the edge of yourself, of coming to a part of yourself that says, just throw it all away. Look at all that opportunity you have. Destroy it. That edge that I think many of us know. Or something that says, take a shortcut, nobody will notice. Or something that says, make it all a bit easier. That's fine. And these, I think, are some layers at which the strange temptations that are related go on. So here's a sonnet called Wild. Because you too struggled, you went into the wild with nothing to shield you from the light. You learned to shade your eyes from the sun. You sweated in your sleep in the heat of the day. You made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. It didn't work. You wrestled with a devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of your cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you, all bat wings and hooves. He was always with you, but you didn't see that till the end. You'd been worrying about food and flight and fancy and how to be who you were. You'd been worrying about prayer and the way a man should care for his country when his country's a plaything for a despot. You'd been worrying about thirst and endings. You feared death, not fear, but both made you feel like a failure. I am intrigued by this character of Jesus of Nazareth, and I'm intrigued by trying to take him seriously. And by taking him seriously, it is to ask questions about why, about him, to look at how frustrating he would have been to have known, to look at how impossible it would have been to have been his mother, and to look at her, I think, with a sense of deep empathy for the burden that she carried and the love that she carried too. When I think about poetry and prayer, I often think that there's no space between the two, and not only poems that mention the idea of God. Really, for me, poetry has been the alchemy of language that has helped. You see that the earliest poets in the Jewish tradition understood that the world was made through poetry, God speaking language and something coming to be. And if you told somebody in your life that you hated them every day for a year, you would create something to be or destroy something. If you tell someone you love them, you can create something to be too. I think we have been circling around this question about language. It's just a noise we make with our mouths and our throats, just something we make with our bodies. It's something we write. It's something we say towards each other. But nonetheless, it does seem to have some peculiar way of setting in sound, in a sonic truth, something that echoes deeper simply than a bodily function. And I have had some terribly difficult times in my life. I did not have an easy childhood. And strangely, I think somebody somewhere mentioned the word poetry to me before I knew what it meant. And it has saved my life. So here's a little science fiction poem in praise of poetry. It's called The One Thing. There must have been some other me who lived some other time who realized he knew the one thing that would save me. And he must have found a window, opened it, and shouted through it that saving sound that saved me. And he must have felt a failure, I'm sure, that other me, because he failed. He did. He didn't save me from those things that beat me. And he must have sat like some sad god from sadder scriptures and wept at all he failed to do. He had so little time. And all my life, I've been climbing up to little windows, opening them and saying the one thing I can say. Thank you. I'm curious, maybe we can talk about this later on, if you can imagine another you from a parallel universe who could find a window and open it up and shout to the younger you something that would be an accompaniment to you. What would that thing have been? Is it dog? Is it birds? What is it? Is it books? Is it generosity? What is it that has held you steady, not made things easy, but has been something that can hold you steady? Is it a cup of tea in the morning? What is it? Something that has been a small rudder to hold you together. And this too is something in the house of prayer, some kind of rhythm that can keep you steady. I strangely get asked to speak in churches a lot, and it's even more strangely, I think, I get asked to speak in churches where they won't allow women to speak, but they will accept a gay man to speak, which I find very peculiar, and I say no, because I won't do that. And so here's a little sonnet, probably an angry sonnet in response to that. It's not It's often the funky churches that, have trendy sound systems and cool people up front, but no women, that issue invitations to me, and I find that very strange in a time when so much can be reinvented, why it is that a very particularly limited reading of a text isn't opened up. Of all the things to be cool about, equality should be the first. This poem is called Who for Us Men and for Our Salvation. You drink whiskey during poker nights, wear shirts your granddad wore, display the ink that's on your unshaved chest, and sign your texts to me with X's. You drink coffee from a little glass after early morning yoga class. You podcast authenticity and live in parts of the city that others have disdained. You disdain. You oil your beard. You wear 1930s shoes bought for a small fortune in a place you say your granddad would have loved. Like him, you believe a woman's place is not behind the pulpit. Let her lecture in literature. Let her explore the stars. Let her drink. Let her work. But do not let her speak the verb of God in public. Let her mostly be. Here's another. I do love sonnets. Here's a small sonnet about the first exorcism that I was put through. I was 18, and I'm sure that lots of you in here are American. And there is an American mentioned in this, but rest assured that I like many Americans, just not this one. So I'm not talking about you. So I was part of an ecumenical, charismatic group that, like many people in the 90s, and unfortunately today too, believed that gay people needed to be cured. And the first attempt at cure was by saying I had a devil in me. The exorcism. I wish you weren't American. I wish you didn't see intrinsic evil in me. I wish you hadn't dragged my secret from me. Now I know you knew already. Someone squealed. I wish you hadn't put your hands on me while you were screaming at the devils in me, all my homosexualities. I wish you'd never gathered people round, instructing them to pray in tongues, or read from Revelations, or chant, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wish he'd answered. I wish you'd shut up and I repeated, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wished you dead. And I was frightened at the violence in me and the nest of demons in me. I wondered where they lived. In my semen, in the dreams I had of being kissed. Why did they breed in me? My God, my exorcist. Prayer, if it is going to be meaningful, has to be a home for fury also. I discovered that accidentally. I gave up on the idea, really, of prayer for a while, but I needed some way of having a home for fury, and I've always written, and so I was reading Augustine's Confessions, and I'm very fond of St. Augustine, not because I think he was a role model, because I think he wasn't. I'm fond of him because he was so broken in himself in how he wrote. So I'd read a few paragraphs of his confession and then write him a letter. And I have all of those letters still, and they are utterly important to my life. And I found that strangely I was able to, because I wasn't trying to impress him, because he certainly isn't trying to impress anybody else, I found that I made a friend in Augustine, and his deepest gift to me was to create a home for fury in those letters that too are a certain form of prayer. Here is a poem called Abomination, and it's more consoling than you'd think. Years ago I was at this event, and the exorcist, one of them, was sitting a few feet away from me. It was a religious event. I was frightened, I was young. And I closed my eyes I'm not sure what I wanted to do, I tried to get away. And I found myself in a different place when I closed my eyes. I was in a small cave, a quiet cave with the softest grey walls, and there was a pool in the corner, and there was the smell of water in the air, and there was light in the air too. I could see, but I don't know where the light came from. And I suppose I was 21, I'm 46 now, and I still go back to whatever that was. I have no idea. It became a strange place of deep consolation and encounter. There was nobody else there. It was filled with an intimate emptiness, and I found a kindness towards myself in that strange place that I never could have imagined. So here's a poem called Abomination about that. Abomination. Forgiveness? Of course you can have it. Most days I practice forgetting the hold you once had on me. Mostly it works, most days. There is a cave I found once while shaking in a corner of a chapel. When I woke there, I forgot about your lair. Then it came to me, and with me, I make myself there from time to time. It comes with no demand. I enter through the gate with a sign that once said danger, now says home. Another thing that I think is important in the place of prayer is that it can be a place where time can do its own work. It's a line from Patrick Kavanagh, one of my favourite Irish poets. He has a line that says, lie at the heart of the emotion, time has its own work to do. And there is no clearer indication of that than grief, I think, where if we ever need evidence that time is not only chronological, we look at a time in grief where it feels like you got bad news yesterday even though it was a year ago. It feels like something is fresh and old all at once, where anniversaries cause strange things to happen, especially when you've forgotten it's an anniversary and then you remember and you realise, oh God, I dreamt about you last night, or all of these strange ways that time occurs in us, and it does its own work. And I think prayer needs to have its own understanding of the strangeness of time, that we can still feel young in our prayer even though we might not feel young in other times, that something can be present and distant all at once. Grief is a cruel teacher, but one of the things it teaches us is that time is relative and that time has its own work to do, and that we hope we can find the kind of accompaniment to get through. Here's a poem called Now I Watch Through an Open Door. I wrote it about my wonderful, kind, beloved friend Glenn Jordan. I'd known Glenn since I was 11, and he died the first year of COVID in June 2020. And I was devastated, and I know all of us know times like that where you're devastated by grief. And I just kept on looking out the window. I couldn't read, I'm surprised I got any work done. I don't know what I did really for the first month. I somehow managed to get what I needed to do done. But I kept on just looking at the birds. And some of the Irish words for birds are really beautiful. There's a bird called Lasar Quilla, which is it's the goldfinch, but Lasar Quilla means wood flame. And Dridon is the wren, but it means little brown druid. Because you hear them, but you don't see them. I love the wren. And Ri Rua means the red king, and that's the chaffinch. And Corcran Quill is the scarlet sound of the woods, and that is for the bullfinch. There's a bullfinch that lives in the trees near my house, and bullfinches, or certainly our one, are very shy, but they have this gorgeous throaty call, beautiful scarlet sound in the woods. How interesting that they're the sound that's praised. And other animals too. The hare, which is an animal very important in Irish mythology because they're the messengers to the underworld because they're so fast. The hare is the gyoria, which means the low deer. And like a hare is not a bunny. A hare is to a bunny what a Harley Davidson is to a tricycle. a hare can go 50 miles an hour and can kick a fox to death, which is an important thing to know if you're a hare. A fully grown one, not the babies, unfortunately, because there was a baby fox and a baby hare. It was a baby fox and twin baby hares, leverets, in our backyard last year, and then there were one, unfortunately. We heard the sound of a baby hare being eaten by a hungry fox. A terrible reminder of nature, and beautiful too. The song thrush is the guardian of the gates to the underworld in Irish mythology, because the ones who live in the underworld like the song of them, and they keep them there like a radio, really, at the gate, so that they can hear their song echo through the long halls in the underworld. So I found great comfort in the midst of being full of grief, just in basic observation. And it helped to locate me in time, because time was doing all kinds of strange things. A day was at once flying by, and at once it was a millennium until lunch. And it's hard to get up out of bed when you're in grief, and then the day is so long. And then the day flies by and you think, my God, it's a month already, it feels like only a day. And so the birds and the animals looking out the back window that first year of COVID helped me. And this is an elegy and a song of praise to them, as well as to Glenn. Now I watch through an open door. Now I watch through an open door, and there is a chaffinch fighting with another chaffinch. He's punked up the feathers of his head so as to appear a little less tiny. And there is that blackbird hopping, and a song thrush singing at the gate. And here the hare and the hare's 3 babies. I saw them playing the other day, chasing each other like puppies. And the lambs, less manic now that a few months have passed. And their mothers, steady in the rain. This morning I saw 4 Canada geese land in the field like sophisticated aliens, and I raised my hands in thanksgiving at the sight. And I saw a robin standing on a fence post, and the bullfinch's song was the scarlet sound in the long, narrow wood. And you're gone. No more stories about the soft smell of gorse in the morning air along your lovely crooked shore. No more the furious heather, purple and pink in the summer. No more long letters. No more that chest of yours puffed out with laughter or love or a story told again, all filled with air and light, a bird swollen with song. O forest flame, O young light on the old oak, O small brown druid I hear but never see, O red king of the morning, O dainty feet among the dung heaps, O fierce goose and fierce goslings, my muscled hair, rusted by the long evening, my low deer, powerful and insignificant, O Glen, O magnificent. Each of these things, I think, is an attempt at a home for desire, a home for longing. It doesn't create a structure that we'd want. It doesn't turn time back. But it does create a space where we can hear an echo. And in that echo, there might be something like a consolation. Something maybe like a response. Something that helps, which is a basic question about a spiritual practice. Does it help? Doing something because of its punishment value will not sustain, because life will punish you one way or another. What we need is something that actually helps. Not that is pretty, but something that you can manage to turn to and to practice. 3 minutes every day builds up a long faithfulness in the same direction. It's the Nietzsche quote, I believe. I'm going to read just 2 more short poems, little sonnets, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If that's okay? I forget where Jeff's gone. Hiding somewhere. There's one in particular, and I bet you it's the one that I forgot to bring. It is. Right. There is a group back home, I'm sure you have the equivalent in this country. The group back home are called the Samaritans. They're a phone line for when people are distressed and they want to talk to somebody who's trained in listening. And I think the Samaritans are quite extraordinary. My sister's a social worker, one of my sisters, and she said that the training she did to be a Samaritan was the best training she'd ever done in all her career of social work training. I know that probably every county, certainly every state, has a similar free phone line to call if you're feeling distressed and alone. And so here's a poem called Jesus Phones the Samaritans. And all of the words from this are taken from the things that the Samaritans say when somebody phones them. Jesus phones the Samaritans. Samaritans, how can I help? Of course, I'm happy to talk. What name can I call you? You don't need to say anything. That's quite all right. I'm in no rush. I'm just a set of ears for you. It might help if you tell me what's happening. But even if you don't, that's okay. You're welcome to tell me more. What will you do after you hang up? I'm not here to tell you what to do. Are you feeling suicidal? You can call us anytime, night or day. I'm still here. And here's another small poem of fury, and we'll finish with this and then have some Q&A. A friend of mine was working for a denomination that hated him because he was gay. He was ordained in the denomination, and they put some conditions on him that he wouldn't go anywhere gay, he wouldn't sound gay, and he wouldn't dress gay. That apparently was the rules. And so he used to lay out an outfit for the day, every day, on his bed, and then text me a picture and say, "Is this too gay?" And I was like, putting together a little outfit of the day is very gay. Let me just tell you that. So, anyway, this one is called Jesus Dresses. This is part of a sequence of New Stations of the Cross looking at people who are going through sexual torture. Everything from being told how they should act and dress, to thinking who they should call, to trying to call and not getting an answer. All of the things that we know today, and trying to make of those experiences a set of stations. So Jesus here is a blank canvas for the every person. Jesus Dresses. Not that one, you decide, replacing the top that suits you beautifully with the one they won't deride, or at least won't use to justify your firing. You lay out an outfit on the bed, like the clothing for a corpse, and text your friend a shot to check it's not too gay. Texting me your costume of the day is very gay, your friend replies. Plus, you set everything you wear on fire. Over to you, Jeff.
What's your favorite poem and why?
What's my favorite poem of life?
What's your favorite poem and why?
And why? There are a lot of poems in the world. It's like saying, what's your favorite word? I can tell you one of them. It's called Concerning That Prayer I Cannot Make by Jane Mead. She published a book. Her first book is called The Lord and the General Din of the World. And this is the first poem in the first book, Concerning That Prayer I Cannot Make. It's free online if you put Jane Mead, M-E-A-D, Concerning That Prayer I Cannot Make. She just died a couple of years ago, young, unfortunately. She was 61. She was a grape farmer in Northern California, And the opening line of the opening poem of her first book says, "Jesus, I am cruelly lonely, and I do not know that you will answer me, nor do I suspect that you are listening." She has just come out, it seems, from a close reading of the book, although I could be wrong. I know she had come out from rehab, and she is now faced with the crisis of living. And she is in an urban place, she's in a place of industry where there's cranes and broken cars, and there's frost, and the light is glinting through the frost, and it's beautiful, even though the river isn't pretty. There's an industrial bridge going across the river. There's a blue t-shirt snagged in a mostly sunken dead tree. And she's trying to look at herself there. And the poem finishes by her saying, I'm going to misquote it, but it says something like, and here in my palm a pebble slowly turning. Listen, O you bare trees, burrs, brambles, tree half sunk, mostly dead, sunken tree. Listen, 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 I am holy. It's the most extraordinary poem. And that book concerning the Lord and the general din of the world is too. So that's the first one that comes to mind in response to your question. But it has 100 friends that I could also talk about.
One of your books is called Prayer with the Corrymeela Community. Would you speak about prayer in the community?
Thank you. So the Corrymeela community is a reconciliation community that was set up in 1965 in the north of Ireland to be a witness of questioning and dialogue and reconciliation in response to the ongoing conflicts that had erupted as a result of British-Irish conflict in the north of Ireland and partition and a rising violence. Corrymeela was set up before what some people would call the Troubles, and I think being in a community of people of prayer is to recognize that prayer is a gathering together, that there can be a way of gathering around a text and gathering around language that hopefully is doing simple work, and that can provide a rhythm for people who are in a situation of chaos. And I think prayer in that sense is a little bit like a certain kind of community percussion or a community heartbeat. It can be a welcome back, whatever one's position with the question of doctrine or dogma or belief. If the prayer is simple enough and good enough, well then it provides enough of a home for people, whatever their approach to that. And I think that prayer in great simplicity, community prayer in great simplicity, with silence, a few simple words, little preaching, but plenty of space for the heart. It can do all of that in a community. Yeah.
Your work has helped me think about the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little on the role that poetry can play in peacemaking.
So I'm struggling to hear a little bit, but I just want to make sure I heard the question accurately. Yeah.
So you helped me think more deeply about the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you might reflect a little on the role that poetry can play in the messier work of peacemaking.
Peacemaking, yeah. So there's, just as a bit of a kind of an outline in conflict work, there's kind of 5 levels that you can think of when it comes to interventions, some of which might be peacekeeping troops, for instance. You hear that strange phrase that can seem like an anomaly, but it's not, where people would go in simply to almost be a human barricade between people who otherwise might be fighting each other. And peacemaking would be further on in those kinds of 5 levels, in the hope that you can be creating something that is sustainable and thriving and flourishing. Partly why I think any creativity is necessary for the human person, and I despise the idea that creativity automatically means that you need to set up a new website and try to make money out of it, because I think that's the commodification. That's the kind of table that caused fury in Jesus of Nazareth that he wanted to turn over. Creativity is at the heart of the human condition, and we are all creators of life, of other humans, of a table of hospitality, of some words that make sense, of friendship, of a piece of art, of a little song that's hummed, all of these ways, knitting, whatever, there's all kinds of forms of making something, and making something helps you, I think, participate in something that's so deep in us, it's almost hard to put words on. And therefore I think that poetry is something to be proud of. I gave a writing workshop a couple of weeks ago in a school, and there was 15-year-olds there, and there was a 15-year-old next to me called Scarlett, and she was extraordinary. And at the end of the writing workshop she said, "I have written a poem and I love it." And she read it out for everybody, and I loved that she was just like, "I love it." And she was looking at something she'd made in 50 minutes, and these were words that told her who she was, and that were outside of her, but from inside of her. And that, I think, is what we're hoping for in the context of conflict resolution. Conflict, the sustaining of conflict, often has a strained relationship to the question of creating. It has a different approach to the question of time. And creativity in the context of trying to move beyond the sustaining of conflict into the possibility of acting in peace, that is always going to require the further damaging, painful question of what do we want to create rather than how do we wish to cultivate our fury. And that, I think, is a deeply confronting question to ask. And so therefore there is a way within which creativity is always going to be at the heart of the question of peace.
So you clearly have a gift for combining empathy and a beautiful use of the language. So can you tell us a little bit about where that comes from?
I'll try. Thank you for saying that. That's very kind of you. When I was younger, my mother was very sick. And so from the age of 2 to almost 5, I was looked after for maybe 4 or 5 hours a day by a woman who I thought was 200 years old. And she didn't speak any English, she only spoke Irish. Gaelic, you might call it. We don't call it Gaelic, we call it Irish. She was from West Kerry, if any of you know Ireland. She was from Ballyferriter, if any of you know the Dingle Peninsula. I see some people nodding. She was living in Cork, I was born in Blackrock, outside Cork City. And like my dad said years later, he told me that he heard her once try to speak in English. And she had some vocabulary, of course she did. But she had no sense of grammar in English. She only spoke Irish. And so I arrived in school with 2 languages and fascinated. Once I realized that I spoke 2 languages, I was fascinated by it. And that, I think, always meant that there was a conversation between 2 tongues happening in me. And I was intrigued by how you can't directly translate. And that therefore every utterance always has to have at least 2 versions of itself in me. How you'd say it in English and how you'd say it in Irish. And I'm not fluent in Irish. It is a kind of a bone language in me, but I'm very self-conscious about my grammar. But it is nonetheless something like a mother tongue. And I need to emphasize I'm not fluent, but it is nonetheless absolutely part of the heart of me. And I use it every day to myself, wherever I am in the world. And I think that started off the fascination with language in me. I think, I mean, this isn't the time to talk about it, but there was a lot of pain and trauma that lots of us have had, and I had too much of it as a child. And hopefully, if you can survive, and I understand that isn't easy, if you can survive, one of the things that is an invitation into thinking, how can I be part of trying to use language to create a home for others. And that interests me intellectually as well as pastorally. An interest in God provided a way of trying to find language about God that too could be an intellectual stimulation as well as a pastoral consideration. And I have often found that language about God fails in that, because it can have an idolatrous relationship to certitude, which is why I'm in the room next door rather than the room of. And I find that to be a place of deep belonging and a place where I have to take myself and my language seriously in the hope that we can say something that helps.
I think I heard you say, as an aside, I don't quite like the word grace.
Yeah.
And I'm curious.
In fact, I hate it. So I know that other people love the word grace. So I would not in any way wish my thoughts about it to influence anybody. And I know that the word grace can mean many things. I suppose often how I've heard the word grace has been to say, you deserve absolutely nothing, but I'll give you goodness anyway. And I find that completely boring and a failure of an anthropology of the human person. If anybody is in a situation of deep depravity, well then they deserve everything. They deserve deep kindness. I hate the idea of goodness undeserved. I think who decides who deserves what? Do you know? I know I'm in need of deep mercy. I know I screw up. But I'm uninterested in anything that proclaims its goodness while saying, my goodness is so good that I'll be good to you even though you don't deserve the good. I just find that boring and self-adulating. And whether it's a God or a neighbour who says that kind of stuff, I just think, keep it. I don't want it. I don't have strong feelings about it at all.
Earlier, and now 2 questions ago, you mentioned being in the room next door and hearing the murmuring. And I guess with that statement, I'm curious as to where you view, if you view, the location of the divine in the midst of being in the room next to the believers, and not necessarily being amongst them.
Yeah. I mean, I think most churches are filled with large populations of people who are in the room next door, where especially the longer you've stayed in a practice of religion, the more you've thought, look, honestly, I don't know. And that there is that the word agnostic has become a word that you go, oh, actually, that describes where I've been for a long time. And together with that, there is a sense to say, but the practice of this fits like an old jumper, and it gives a great sense of meaning, and it is a home for ethical consideration. It depends, I suppose, as to what the environment has been of earlier life, but I certainly grew up in a kind of, as a young man, when I was more involved in kind of a heavily evangelically influenced group, even though it was ecumenical. The absolute language of power was evangelical, charismatic approach. It was obsessed with heaven and who would and wouldn't get in there, and what they shouldn't do with their bodies with members of the opposite sex, or members of the same sex or the opposite sex, in order to make sure you got in there. And that obsession with the hereafter was a strange betrayal of the idea of an incarnational religion, because it paid no attention to the here and now. And I suppose I'm uninterested in heaven, really. I mean, to be lovely if there was one, but I'm, although I do worry about the administration. But I suppose I think that if time is more generous after death, well then time can look after itself. In the only way I know time, I suppose we all know time in a few ways, I'm interested in trying to do stuff as if this life matters. And that is where I'm oriented towards. And the question for me is, well, does the sacred narrative that you hold help? Or are you still a dick? And for me, I'm looking at ways within which I can be helped, because I need it. I definitely need mercy, and I definitely need support, and I definitely need to learn how to be better. As regards to the location of the divine, I hear the generosity in your question. I was reading the other day a great book from a Methodist minister in Britain. She spent time in Russia. She already had a degree in Russian before she became ordained. She says that one of the names for God in Russian is the other. And one of the names for God in Zulu is Nkulu Nkulu, which means big, big. And I think that there are so many ways to name, and I hear the generosity in what you're saying. Where is the location? I suppose everywhere. And the question really is what is the generosity of the gaze to look at everything in order to find there the intimacy at the heart of everything, in everything. I'm reading Meister Eckhart in the mornings at the moment, 13th, 14th century German mystic, a member of the Dominican order, who was excommunicated kind of around the same time that he died, but probably because the Franciscans hated the Dominicans, really. It was just a kind of an internal spat between these emerging religious congregations. And he has a fascination with what he calls unknowing, and a fascination with this intimate nothing. And I think that that's great language. Whenever I still cross myself or genuflect in a church, because I like housing in the body some action. But I think I could genuflect in front of every person and to be doing the same thing, because to be alive and to be in front of somebody else who is alive is a great mystery. Sometimes I think that God is found in the word you. I've been thinking about the word you a lot, and that every utterance of the word you is the possibility of something that can change a life. So maybe God's found there. Maybe God's found in the space in between. I could keep whittering on, but I don't know, but I'm fascinated by the question, and the generosity with which it was asked.
Hi, I'm going to start with a little story that leads to my question and to
Fantastic.
you all here tonight. When I was 13 years old, I visited an aunt who lives in New Mexico, and she took me to a Taos reservation where we stayed, and it was my 13th birthday, and when one of the men there learned that it was my birthday, he gave me a feather, and he told my aunt to teach her how to pray. I hadn't grown up in the church. Now I'm a Methodist pastor down the street from here. But I feel like if there were a portal, to think of your sci-fi poem, that might be some other life of mine calling to me with a phrase that ended up shaping me, and it hit me when I was 13. I'm here tonight with a group of the congregation class, some of the congregation class from the Westfield Church. And I'm wondering what you might say to 13-year-olds about prayer as something they can hold on to.
Well, I think in many ways I'd be more interested in hearing what they'd say to me about prayer and to us about prayer. I'm curious what works. You'd be very well. Blame the minister. You're very welcome to answer if you want. I mean, we can leave it rhetorically if you'd rather, but if any of you want to say, I'm not looking for any one answer. Some of you are making a magnificent study of the ground in front of you.
But I like that answer. What works?
Well, I suppose what I'd say to 13-year-olds is that question, what works? There is so much happening in your life, so much magnificence friendships and study and demand and your own opinions and what you know about the world, what you know to be true, what you're discovering that is that's leading you in your own level of integrity that's different to how you've been told, how everything that you have in your mind is so important, and how you relate that to others. And for me, the question is, what works to give that respect? You know, what's a practice? So that's what I think is helpful about prayer, is to find a certain house of belonging, even in yourself, that says there's more to be discovered and to feel turned towards with a sense of attention and respect. That's what I'd say.
Wow, I just want to thank you for that. Because I've been sitting here saying, I'm working on some children's curriculums, and I was just sitting here saying, how do we work this kind of questions? And how do we teach children to ask the questions instead of the rhetoric of answers that have not really worked for almost anybody? And so I'm just wondering if, I don't know if you have children or you have worked with children, but I would love to hear a story or two if you work with 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm just asking. So.
Yeah, I used to be a school chaplain. I suppose first of all, I think and I think this is present in your question, that I'm fairly uninterested in teaching children to do anything that I'm not doing myself. And I think the surest way to create a practice of curiosity and the intellect is for there to be an environment of curiosity and the intellect for everybody of all ages. And that, I think, shows a way forward, rather than a place where there are lessons to be learnt and get the answers right. That just shows the way out. I certainly left that. So I don't know that I don't think this was in your question, but I'm really uninterested in trying to appeal to people to join something. I'm really interested in practicing something that works. And then whoever wants to join can, if they want. And that's for people of all ages. Some stories, there are so many. I trained in Ignatian prayer many years ago. I have an old friend in Ignatius of Loyola, that Basque saint, who was far from a saint, who founded the order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. And he had been a soldier, and he had kind of gone through 30 exercises for being a soldier in combat. And he was quite a Methodist, really, because when he got injured and he was convalescing and had very little to do and very little to read, and he decided to come up with 30 spiritual exercises to focus the soul. And I found them really, really helpful when I went through them many years ago. And so one of the things he does is to say, read a text and to put yourself into the text and ask some questions of the text. In a certain sense, it's like a Christian form of prayerful midrash, provided you can take yourself seriously enough to say what you really should be, what you really think, rather than what you think you should be saying. So for a long time, I've led those kinds of Ignatian meditation exercises with young people. I did it. Do any of you know Holden Village? It's Lutheran. Some of you certainly will. It's a Lutheran retreat centre in the Cascades. And I, like a fool, signed up to give the children's talk on a Tuesday night. And there was about 30 young people from the age of 5 to 17. Those are very different populations of young people. And I was giving the talk. And I asked them to take a walk in their imagination and to go where they wanted to go, and that Jesus would come along and say hello. And I knew all their names, so I said all their names, and then said, and then you can say whatever you want to him. He asks you a question about what's working, and you can talk to him and ask him any questions, and then say goodbye to him. A very, very simple kind of meditation. And then I said, I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can keep your answers to yourself. If you don't want to talk to me, that's totally fine. And the replies that they gave were interesting. I've done this with hundreds of groups of young people, and I'm always curious to hear what they say, because I take them seriously. And so normally I say, where were you going? What was it like? What was he like? What kind of a person would you say he was? What kind of a person would you say he was? What kind of a person would you say he'd say you were? Just ways of using the imagination. Anyway, there was about 30 of them, so I wasn't hearing the same answer from all of them. And I had started off by saying, where are you going? And I only got an answer from a smattering of them. And there was one small girl who was in a stripy pink dress, and she was like the angel of death wandering around the room. And she was grumbling, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," while I was trying to hold this meditation. She was like Kronos there present among us. She was extraordinary. Wandering among the stars looking for a place to call home. And anyway, I asked 4 or 5 of them, where were you going? And one of them said, we were walking to a candy store, we were walking to my granny's house, we were walking, nice things. And then I moved on. And this small little boy put his hand up and he said, you didn't ask everybody else the same question. And I was like, oh yeah, I know, yeah. He was 4.5, I found out. And I said, where were you going? And he went, Sam's house. Like we all should have known, and like I was a fool. And it was his indignation that, like, I should have known he was going to Sam's house that I loved. And so I got to know him during the week. And I sat next to him one time at lunch. His parents were there. And his mother said, I knew he was going to Sam's house because it's the only place he's allowed to go. Sam's house is next door. And there's a hole in the hedge, and it's the only place he can go. And she said, I watched the two of them talking. And she said, like, what do 4.5-year-olds have to talk about? And she said, I ask him every now and then and he won't tell me. And one day I walked into the chapel for evening prayer at Holden, and he was sitting at the back. Clark was his name. He was sitting at the back in between his parents like a little sandwich. And he turned around, saw me, and he held up his fist behind his head to give me a fist bump. And I thought, if a 4.5-year-old thinks you're worthy of being greeted, your whole world is made. So that's, I think, a story about prayer and young people. But he had so much to say, and I loved that his world was small and that he demanded it to be known by everybody. Sam's house.
Thank you so much. We run an international institute on religion and cultural transformation here at Drew.
Okay.
A number of our people are actually into core and, of course, say wonderful things. And many of them are deeply religious people, right? We bring imams, rabbis, pastors from around the world. And so I'm thinking a lot talks about prayer and the work that time has to do, as well as some extent sacred space. And so for me, one of the problems we're seeing in the world is so deeply religious people, I think, can respect each other even when there are different faiths. At a certain level that you reach, an imam respects a rabbi, and likewise, and a reverend. And so, why is it though, just your thoughts, on places where there's so much conflict in the world around us, in Jerusalem right now, in Babu Maji, right? There's places where you would think that people of different faiths might be able to respect the holy space, and instead those become the places where we see the worst conflict. So if you think about, again, back to prayer, space, time, all these things, how can you get people to think more about those as places where they can actually come together?
Yeah. It's a complicated question, isn't it? It's hard to know. I think of myself in times when I was the most defensive about religion, and I think of the level of fear that I had ingrained in me, and the level that unless I defended it, the whole house of cards would fall. Or perhaps I saw a career for myself and thought, if I'm seen to be wavering, well then somebody might see me and I mightn't progress. Even in tiny, silly ways in a prayer group in Dublin, like the idea that was a career, but nonetheless there was the idea of a certain way forward. And each of those, I think, are a strange denial of death. And certainly what Christianity promises is crucifixion, and that if you love anything, it will have to die. And that is certainly true of the relationship to institution. You know? And if you're unwilling for it to die, you'll probably end up in leadership. And that's a terrible thing and an invitation, because you love the thing that you probably need to learn to step a bit away from, and you need to step closer to the thing too. And that is an exercise in, I suppose, what Ignatius would call of active detachment. I started myself because I hate the idea that we live in a world where some people are involved in religion for purely political reasons. But like hearing what the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church says chills me to the bone. Hearing what other Irish and British people say about religion when it comes to the question of Britain and Ireland chills me to the bone. So I don't feel like I'm in any position to judge anyone, but I am shocked at the level of lack of self-reflection in myself when I was younger and today, to be honest, as well as ways within which questions about violence and threat don't seem to have entered the minds of some people in public life. Like I think of the people who led the organisation that I was part of when I was being put through exorcisms. And I was 18, you know, I thought I was old. You know, I look at 18-year-olds now who are being put through that. I get contacted, unfortunately, regularly by people who are being forced through these terrible things. And I have to develop a relationship with my own fury toward the people who are leading those things to think, have you no respect? And I wish that belonging to a religious congregation or a religious practice, whether that's a yoga studio or a denomination, I wish that would necessarily lead to spiritual reflection and a relationship with the fact that things will end, but it doesn't. I don't feel like I'm any further along, but I think if there's anything I try to do is to practice failure and vulnerability in public, and I'm saddened that for some people that's a threat. So, like when it comes to thinking about places like Ireland, like Jerusalem, like many places where the halls of religion are the places that are stoking the fires of division. Often what I think is necessary is not to move away from your religious tradition, but to move closer to it. Through the guidance of the mystics, through the guidance of the people who were hated when they were alive and who were adulated once they're dead. Mother Julian of Norwich, for instance, or all of these people. Every tradition has them. People who will say, Dorothy Day, people who will say the kind of things that people hate to hear but we know are true, and that speak to the dynamics of power that are present in these magnificent and malevolent bodies that we belong to. I think that's all I can say at the moment. I'm sure, otherwise I'll not stop talking.
Can you take one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question yet? Give everybody a chance to do this. Yes.
It's not really a question. I just want to thank you for your humbleness and your kindness and your gentleness in a world that has been so cruel to you, and being a teacher to all of us, and giving that to us. So thank you.
That's kind, thank you. I hope those things are true. I try to make them true. But if you're seeing them, it means that you're acting them too. So.
Can we thank Pádraig Ó Tuama?
Very kind, thank you. I'll finish with a poem. My life was changed regularly. All of our lives are changed by small incidences. A number of years ago I thought, I'm going to read through all of Emily Dickinson's poems. There's 1,775 of them, just in case you're wondering. And I thought it'll take me a year. I thought I'll read a clump every day or so. Anyway, it took me 2 years. And somebody said to me at the end of it, well, you really must have a great grasp of Emily Dickinson now. That's a little bit like saying you must have a great grasp of the universe. Because I was bewildered by the end of it. I felt like I'd gone on safari and I was just lucky to get out alive, and that I had seen strange, unexplainable things on the journey. And I found myself thinking about how similar it is to the question of God, really. That really we're just lucky to even comprehend, not even comprehend, we're lucky to have the questions. It's like asking a question of dark matter. It's like asking a question of what would it be like to be outside of time? And I found myself thinking about how uninteresting it is to think that knowledge is graspable, and how glorious it is to not know, and how that is an invitation, not a defeat, into the question of Emily Dickinson and everything that she comprehended. So here's a poem. I think it's about not understanding Emily Dickinson, but I think it's also about not understanding God. And I think it's about becoming wary of the idea of belonging, because belonging can be beautiful, but it also can establish a border. And therefore people can be let in or kicked out or not let out at all. So this is a poem of thanks to you for the generosity of the invitation. Thanks to Jeff and everybody at this church, this house of question and curiosity and practice and attention to each other's lives, and all the places that you come from too, all the questions you have, all the ways that you make meaning and share meaning and do generous things for each other. It's a poem in honor of all of those things in the midst of all of the things we don't know. It's called Let the Waters Swarm with a Swarm of Living Beings. I've been swimming around here for a while now, and while I've never touched the ocean floor, I've tried. You notice things out here, the way the wind makes waves chop at odd angles, the way the water feels warmer at the top, the way the moon makes music when you're half dead with cold, the ways of frozen bones, the way the morning never feels the same. Once a seal bumped me, came right up to me like a sea puppy, and I swear it smiled. I was floating happy after that. I said, the ocean is my home. Then the storm came, then the waves, then the lightning spiked the surface, thunder clapped, hungry beasts swam round me. I saw seagulls eyeing me for scraps. Thank you very much. And let's meet each other and have a chat.